So welcome everyone to the Accepted Students panel. We're really excited to have our participants here today, as well as our panelists, to answer questions that you all have about the application cycle for the 2022 application year. Before we go ahead and dive into live Q&A, I would like our panelists to introduce themselves, and they'll share their name, grad year and major, health profession, and the school they intend to attend in the fall or are considering. Jared, would you like to start us off?
Sure. How's it going, everyone? Thanks for coming. My name is Jared Jacobson. I was class of 2020 for undergrad, but I'm currently in the Master of Public Health program. So it's class of 2021. And I was a bio and psych minor as well. And I'm in the process kind of wrapping up applying to dental schools. Probably gonna end up going to Boston University, but also considering Tufts.
Thank you, Jared. And Layla, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Hey everyone, my name is Layla. I was class of 2019 at Northeastern. I studied neuroscience and minored in photojournalism, but I'm currently in a Master's in Public Health program as well at GW. And I'm still trying to make a decision for which med school I want to go to. But right now I'm considering Hopkins in Baltimore as well as Mount Sinai in New York, and still waiting to hear back from a couple schools.
Thank you, Layla. Sophia, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Sophia. I'm a current fourth year biomedical physics major, so I'll graduate in May. I am applying to MD PhD programs, so kind of the dual degree. Right now, the top contender is University of Chicago, but I'm also waiting for decisions from like Harvard and Penn and UCSD and a couple other places.
Awesome. And Andrea, last but certainly not least, we'd love to hear from you.
Hi everyone, my name's Andrea. I'm a current fourth year BNS major and math minor, applying to MD programs. I have not made a decision yet. I'm still waiting to hear back from a couple schools, but hopefully I will be able to tell you guys soon where I plan on going.
Awesome. So thank you guys all for introducing yourselves. From here, we're just going to go into live Q&A. So participants, please feel free to use the chat to ask your questions of our panelists, and just pay attention to the chat to ensure that your question hasn't already been asked so that we can get through as many questions as possible. So as I'm waiting for you guys all to fill that chat with your questions, I'm going to go ahead and start off the questioning for our panelists. So panelists, if you were to go through the application process again, what's one thing you'd do differently and why?
I can start. I think this is probably something kind of related to COVID. I would probably kind of evaluate schools differently. I think as an applicant, it's super easy to get wrapped up in like rankings and just say you want to go to like all these top schools, which I think is super important. But I feel like as I, looked at schools more seriously, after getting interview invites, I kind of noticed things that really did matter, such as, the community, the school, is it really competitive or collaborative? And just things like that, that really more focused on like my happiness as a person. So I could really balance that with also succeeding in medical school.
Thanks, Andrea. Would somebody else like to also address that question? What would you do differently and why?
Yeah, I think to echo that, I think a lot of it is just trying to find your own fit, your best fit. For some of them, maybe I just applied to some schools because they were my in-state school, and I was it was just a given I was going to apply there, and it was kind of an afterthought. But after interviewing and stuff like that, I was maybe this is a really good fit for me. So just not ruling out schools immediately, I think, is a big thing. And also for the actual writing the applications, I think downloading Grammarly or something like that is definitely key. That I should have done a little earlier, just because you're constantly checking grammar and want to make sure everything's perfect.
Yeah, that's absolutely not to be understated. The application itself is pretty lengthy and includes a lot of writing. So you do want to ensure that you're dedicating enough time to editing and spell checking your application before you submit it, because once you do hit that submit button, you can't make those changes any longer. And finding schools that are a good fit for you are super important as well, because it's going to help aid the whole application process. So thank you guys all for your responses. Our next question comes from one of our participants. How many programs did you guys end up applying to? And how did you reach that number? Would Layla or Sophia like to start?
I can start. So I only applied to MD PhD programs. And so I was really applying like all over the country because geography isn't so much of a factor in those like admissions processes. So I ended up applying to, I think, 20 schools and then attended 12 interviews. And I think it was a little bit easier because I was only applying to like the NIH funded programs or like MSTP programs. So the way that I kind of like chose my list was there are only like 40 something of those programs. So I was just like, all right, I got to cut it in half. Let's figure out which schools like have the research that I'm most interested in, which is like neuroscience research. And where is a place that I could see myself living for 8 years. And so it was kind of like two factors that brought it down to around 20.
And Layla, how many did you end up applying?
Yeah, for me, it was also a bit higher, around like 23, I think, because for me, it was because I qualified for the fee assistance program. So if you should check that out. It gave me the flexibility to sort of like add more like reach schools if necessary. And sorry for clarification, it pays for your primary application fee. And for me, when I was picking my schools, it was very much like location based, also like wanting to have like a very social justice oriented mission. And those were the like factors that were important to me.
So it sounds like you guys really had to narrow down your schools list by finding schools that you considered a good institutional fit. National averages, just FYI, for the number of schools that applicants typically apply to is somewhere between 15 and 20. So you guys stayed pretty relatively close to that. That is a little bit different for dental programs. There are fewer dental programs in the country. Jared, was your number different than that average 15 to 20 for our pre-med students?
Yeah, it was a little lower. I ended up applying to 14, but kind of same choosing criteria.
Awesome. Yeah, that's definitely more aligned with what we see for dental programs, typically 10 to 12. So our next question from one of our participants is about entrance exam preparation. Did any of you ever feel blocks or anxiety during preparation for your MCAT or DAT? And how did you overcome and motivate yourself through that?
I can start. Yes, absolutely. The answer to that question is yes. So I took the MCAT and I was scheduled to take it in April of last year. But unfortunately, we all know the pandemic hit and everything kind of got thrown out of whack. And so that entire process of having to like reschedule and revamp my study schedule to push back I think I ended up taking it at the end of June. So that kind of like flexibility was not something that I like initially expected when starting my like study schedule. So yeah, I would say that there were a lot of roadblocks, especially in between that like April to June period, both from the MCAT and also because we were living through a like global crisis. And so I think that it's just important to like maintain perspective, and that's something maybe I wish I knew a little bit more going in. And just making sure that like you don't wake up and study and don't leave your house all day. Like it's important to like do things that like get you excited. Like I would go for runs, or I would like cook a fun meal or dessert or something. And so I think it's just finding that balance while also, yes, you do have to put in a lot of hours of like studying and revising and everything like that. but like not letting it overwhelm you. I think the times when I most felt like in a roadblock was when I was trying to allocate too much time rather than not enough.
Thank you. And Andrea, I think you were going to say something as well.
Yeah, I mean, my experience was really similar because I was scheduled to take it in May and then it was just a disaster. But yeah, I mean, I definitely made a lot of mistakes along the way. Like I probably should have like devoted more time to like self-care and stuff. So it's definitely a really important thing. And I think part of that was like, hopefully this cycle won't have to deal with that, was just like, I literally never knew when I was supposed to take it. So I was like, well, what if I have to take it like in 3 weeks, which didn't happen. But I think that's a really huge thing. It's something I've also been able to like learn a lot throughout the pandemic, which I think will help me a lot in medical school. Is like studying is super important. We should all do it, but definitely, like Sophia said, like make sure you are blocking out times to do something fun for yourself, even if it is just like watching Netflix for like an hour or things like that, because that'll keep you motivated. And just having a reason, like a bigger reason as to why you're doing this, will just really get you through the process.
Awesome. So our next question, well, it's two different questions. I'm going to merge it into one because I feel like they're very related. So the first is, how much time did you dedicate to your primary application and to each secondary application on average? And what advice do you have for secondaries?
I can go again. I think the biggest thing, well, the primary application, I think the pre-health assessment that we did was really helpful because it just got you thinking about just all the different things you want to talk about. So I feel like the primary wasn't too bad. I'd say, like we kind of mentioned before, proofreading is really big on that. Like I had my best friend like the night before proofread it for me and things like that. So definitely recommend that. And then secondaries can take a lot of time to, but that also depends on the school, because I had some schools that wanted like 9 essays and then other schools that were like, we just want one. And then there are also repeats. So like as you do some, you end up being able to just use the same essays, like the same, like again and again, and just changing them slightly. So I can't really put like a time like on each of them, but I would just say like as soon as you get them, look at the prompts, start like take a day and just like brainstorm and like think about it. And then obviously try to submit them within that like 2-week period. That's really recommended. It's a tough like couple weeks, I think, when you're really doing them, but then afterwards it just feels so good and you're really just waiting. So then you get a lot of rest in between.
Yeah, I can go next. So one thing that I didn't realize going in is for like MD, PhD applications, you write your personal statement, but there are also 2 additional essays included in the primary application. One, I think, is your like significant research essay, and then the other is kind of like a why MD, PhD essay. So I think in comparison to kind of like my friends that were applying to medical school, I spent longer on the primary application because I had to kind of go through the process of creating this like perfect, or I wouldn't say mine's perfect, but as close to good as it can be, 3 separate times. And then I would say that Andrea has like a really good system. I tried to submit 1 to 2 secondaries a day in like, call it like a 2-week long period, I think is how it worked out.
Just so our participants know, when was that 2-week period for you? Was it mid-July or?
Oh gosh. So I think this past application cycle was delayed in terms of COVID. And so I think it was mid to late July, maybe submitting my last ones in early August.
That's pretty typical. So typically when you submit your primary application, is about 4 to 6 weeks later that medical schools will receive your application, and then you'll start to get your inbox flooded with secondary application invitations. Jared, the dental application is obviously very different. The secondary prompts are in ADSES. So did you have to take a little extra time to fill out your primary with those supplemental questions kind of embedded within it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it like I was gonna say, so many of the schools, or a decent amount of them, they have like their questions right in there. So it's kind of nice because while you're writing your personal statement and all that, you can prepare for those secondary um, questions. And but a decent amount of the time, like they're not really similar because a lot of them want to see like what you'll do for that school and that area specifically, and every area is different. But I found it like pretty easy, and I kind of knew that it was a one shot thing, which I enjoyed. Some schools did have some secondary questions with their, like if you got an interview there, but it was only if you got an interview. So then you only had to worry about it then, and then they would give you like a week or so to do it. So that wasn't too bad. I've had to do some of those, but it's definitely a little different.
Thanks, Jared. Our next question is about the fee assistance program. Layla, you might be able to share a little bit more about that with us. So can you talk more about how you applied for the fee assistance program and what that process looked like?
Yeah, so for the fee assistance program, they asked for both my income as well as my parents' information. And I think that I'm not entirely sure. I'm reading the question about like whether they won't factor in your parents' information, but I think that you can send an appeal to them to say like, oh, well, they're not actually supporting me financially, and you're not reported as their dependent. Like I think that you can send that to them, or you can call them. They were very receptive to my questions over phone, a lot more than email. And yeah, I'm sorry I can't give you like a specific answer to that question, but yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, if anybody out there is thinking that they might apply or might qualify, it's absolutely worth looking into. And there are fee assistance programs for all the health professions we advise on. I'll actually in the chat link our webpage that has direct links to all those fee assistance programs. And like Layla said, if you have questions about the fee assistance program and whether you qualify, the best way to go about it is to just contact them directly and explain your situation. Our next question, were any of you working and in school while applying? Any advice on how to balance that?
I can start this one off. So yes, I've always had a job throughout my time at Northeastern. My freshman year, it was like not medically related at all. I was working as a soccer coach. But then as I like started co-op, my third year, I was working 2 different jobs and taking classes. And so I was working at a lab doing like neuroscience research, and I was also working in like a clinical care technician at Tufts. So more of like a clinical position. And I will never say that it's easy. There are like weeks that you're just like entirely booked out. And so I think my best advice would be to like find jobs that understand your position. Like they understand that you are not just an employee there, you are also a student, and maybe you are also an employee of like another place as well. And so I found that having like supportive mentors and supervisors was something that like when I actively looked for them in like the job seeking process, it made the ability to balance multiple roles so much easier. Just like having that flexibility was really key for me.
Yeah, I think if you're able to like find an on-campus job too, a lot of times they're super understanding because they're all at Northeastern. I also think like if you were able to conquer the test while you were working and in class, like the application process should be like just as fine if you're able to do that. Writing the application is definitely very time intensive, but the waiting period, you're just waiting. So I think definitely you'll be able to do school and work during that. You might be a little bit anxious the whole time, like every time you get an email. I think I found myself doing that whenever I was doing work. But when it comes time to interviewing, I don't know, obviously next year what the situation is, but having the virtual interviews was made it very easy. I mean, like I interviewed at University of Southern California, and I was like, originally I wasn't gonna apply there, and I was like, well, I'm not gonna have to go to LA like in the middle of the school year, so I'll apply and see what happens. So there's definitely some pros, I would say, of the virtual interviews.
And from what we're hearing from health professional programs, a lot of them are at least considering keeping a hybrid model to their interviews for the upcoming application cycle, meaning that they will be extending offers for both in-person and virtual options, depending on the applicant's preference. So that might be, and that's definitely a nice thing. That was very different this year than previous years in terms of managing all those time commitments and time off. But I mean, it sounds like from both of our respondents that, you know, having jobs that understand that you're applying to these programs is really important. And when it comes to gap year jobs, I will say most employers go into that knowing they're going to need some flexibility. So that's good to hear. Our next question is about deciding to apply. How did you decide when it was the right time for you to apply that versus like waiting until a future cycle? And did you feel fully prepared when you applied? And I think this is a great question for all four of our panelists today. So whomever wants to start.
I can start. Personally, I think this is just such like a big life decision. Like you're never really going to feel like 100% ready just because it's such a big change. And I was even saying that to like my friend this morning when she was asking like, have you decided? And I'm like, do you feel ready to decide? And I'm like, I don't think I'll ever feel like so super ready to decide. But I think you just have to reach a certain like level of confidence knowing you have, you know, all the right experiences and you feel like mature enough and ready for that type of change if you do have to move somewhere far away. And you know, you might not want more time with a gap year to do something else. And that's something also like your individual advisor like Sarah, like I asked her a bunch of questions along the way, like especially with COVID when I thought like things might not work out and I might have to take time off. So I think it's a really personal decision that you might not ever feel super ready for just because it's such a big change, but it's also an exciting one. And I think that, you know, as long as you're following all the things that you know you need to get done and you kind of just feel it in your heart, even though that's not a super logical way to go about it, it's a really exciting thing to kind of embark on.
I can go next. So to be completely candid, there were some, so I applied my junior year of college, which is kind of, I think, the earliest you can. And to be candid, at many interviews, I was the only one who hadn't taken a gap year. So I think like whatever you choose to do, there are people also making that decision. So I think it really is kind of a personal one that you need to make for yourself and not for like anyone else around you. Another thing I like to point out, especially for MD PhD applications, is research time is really important. Like having that dedicated time in lab to like learn and grow and really like become an independent scientist before you apply to these programs is really important. One thing that I think Northeastern does really well is I feel like I was able to get that through my co-ops. I actually did two co-ops at the same lab. And I'm still working there. So by now I feel really comfortable in my abilities as a scientist. If I had gone to a school that didn't really allow for as much protected research time, maybe I would have felt less comfortable applying because I would have not had like as much time to develop like my research and scientific interests. So I would say I'm gonna echo and say that you never feel 100% prepared. But that's because no one ever is 100% prepared. That's just a myth. I think it's just understanding where you are, like how you feel that you've grown over your time in college and other experiences, and then really like look inwards and see if like now is the correct time for you.
So for me, it was a bit of a last minute decision in a way. I kept flip-flopping between going to med school, not going to med school all of undergrad. And then it wasn't until I think October, November 2019 that I was like, okay, wow, like I really do want to go to med school. And that's a bit late, especially when I didn't have much clinical experience at that point. So I definitely did not feel prepared, but I went to talk to Rob, the other pre-med advisor, and he was like, yeah, you're kind of close, but like it's feasible. And I think that, well, one, if I could do it like at that late in the game, like you're definitely prepared. But I think it's a matter of, do you feel as if like you need to be confident in your own accomplishments? Like you've done all the work, like you've done all the classes, you've done all these activities, and you need to realize that like that is your story and you can tell your story confidently. And I think that was the most important part of it. It wasn't, oh, I need to get like 1,000 clinical hours. It's okay, well, maybe I don't have 1,000 clinical hours. Here are my steps where I would like to get those hours. So I started scribing and putting that in the application, and then speaking on the experiences I did have. I think that is what helped me.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, I feel like I could have put forward a stronger application, but I could have put forward like a much weaker application. So it's just, I felt comfortable applying at the time that I did. I was lucky enough to, I mean, it wasn't lucky, but I took my DAT like the week kind of everything started hitting the fan. I took it like mid-March. So I got my test in. So that made me honestly feel like a lot more comfortable applying. But yeah, similar, like I knew I wanted to go into healthcare. I didn't really know too much. My aunt's a dentist, so I always kind of like gravitated towards that. And I think specifically through doing my master's, I kind of saw the intersection between oral health and public health, and that became kind of my niche, my thing. And like I think I was really able to hammer that home in the applications, and I think that speaks more volumes than, maybe someone did this job for this long or whatever. So I think it's just conveying whatever passion you have. And since I was able to do that, I felt more confident in applying.
Thank you all. And, I'll echo what all of our panelists have said in kind of reflecting on my experiences with students over the past few years. I think what's really evident when I chat with students is that no one, and trust me, even if you feel that your peers are so confident, no one is 100% confident going into this application process. It's about identifying when's the right time for you. If you feel that you have enough, if you've done enough, and if you feel that your application is strong for this particular cycle. And if the answer is yes, that's great. Move on and you'll do it and you'll give it your best effort. Your experiences are not going to look like another person's, nor should they. But if you decide that you're going to defer your application, what I can say with confidence is that I've never met anyone who's ever regretted taking additional time before applying, ever. And 80% of Northeastern students do take gap years. So your timeline is self-created and it should reflect what you're most comfortable doing. Our next question is about the application cycle generally. Of the entire application cycle, from when you submit to acceptance, which obviously is still ongoing, what has been the most challenging aspect in your opinion?
Writing secondaries. I did not enjoy that at all. I'm someone who really enjoys interviewing, and I really loved like the majority of my interview experiences because I really like talking to people. But the secondaries definitely did get a little bit overwhelming, especially since I did apply to like 20 programs. And at that point, you just get to a point where you're like, I don't want to write about myself anymore. But I think it's like when you get to that point, you're like, okay, I'm taking a couple of days off. And you're like, if I submit it at like day 15 or day 16, like that's not infinitely worse than submitting it like day 14. Like the 2-week is a good guideline, but don't let it like overrule your life.
I think something that like I kind of got caught up in that made it a little hard was just constantly checking those like forums online and Facebook and all that, because you're constantly comparing yourself to other people. And just because someone gets an interview in August doesn't mean that you're not going to get one maybe in January. Like schools are interviewing that whole time. So it was really hard to like not compare myself to other people, especially people who all I knew was their screen name on like SDN. So that was probably my biggest thing.
Yeah, I would actually second that. And also, kind of what Sophia said, there really was a point in my life where I was like, if I don't submit this secondary on day 14, like it's game over. Like that's not true. Like I got an interview to school, which I almost like didn't even apply there. And I literally submit my secondary, like, I don't know, they had a deadline, but it was like a day before. So like you really just never know what's going to happen. And I think also another challenging part for me personally, and kind of like what Sophia said, just because I am on like the younger side, being only 21, is even just like choosing where you're going to go. I think that big change, and like, especially like I'm from Boston, and I'm likely not going to stay in Boston, just like moving away from family and friends. It's a different type of like difficult than writing like 30 essays in a week. But I think that's also something to just kind of like mentally prepare yourself for, that you might need to make those decisions, but it is still like super exciting. So it's something to look forward to.
So thank you guys all for sharing. And I will echo what a few of you said. Stay away from the internet. It's dangerous. You can find information that will scare you like very easily on SDN. And a lot of it is very like built up, like it's not super accurate all the time. So just be careful of what you're trusting in terms of what's on the internet and what you're reading, and know that waiting sometimes is the hardest part. But waiting is a normal part of the application process that everybody has to go through. So do be prepared for that. Our next question is for Sophia. Sophia, as an MD PhD applicant, how important do you feel are publications and other research accomplishments in the application process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And honestly, a weak point that I felt in my own application. So I applied with no publications. I still have nothing in press. We have one paper in like revisions right now. But I applied, interviewed, and was like accepted at multiple places before even telling them that I had like submitted a paper. So I'd say no, it's not a requirement. But on the flip side, having like significant research experience is. And so the field that I work in is systems neuroscience. And so in that field, papers can take anywhere from 4 to 10 plus years, especially like in my lab, which has a very like high standard of when papers go out to publication. So I think everyone that you're interviewing with is also either a scientist or a physician scientist. And those are the people that are reviewing their application. So they understand that sometimes in undergrad, getting published is getting lucky sometimes, like you just happen to come into the lab at the right time on the right project. But it doesn't, like having a publication doesn't replace the need for really being able to talk to like other scientists and maybe even like experts in the field about your research and kind of like being able to hold your own. One thing I really think about is applying to MD PhD. What I've heard is like some people like grill you about your research. But for me, those were like the most fun conversations because I love talking about my research because I love what I do. And that's why I'm applying to like even get my PhD in the first place. And so I think that might be a better way to judge how quote unquote like ready someone is to apply to MD PhD is if you would feel comfortable talking to like a leading expert in your field about your research, rather than how many publications do I have, what author am I, such and such.
That's really great advice, Sophia, for MD PhD applicants. Another dual degree question. Layla and Jared, how did you each decide that you wanted to do an MPH before starting your respective programs?
So mine was because I thought I wanted to be in public health and not in med school. I just very much had an interest in like social justice, photography, arts, plus health. And I just like thought public health was a great way to do that. And so that's why like I went into the MPH. But when I was in it, I missed like the individual individual interactions with people and like the science and all of that. So that's what took me a little bit more back to med school. And I really appreciate the ability to do both, to think like both at that individual level that med school will give me, but also look at the general context and systems that people are working in and living in and existing in, and just trying to figure out how to balance those two and make change in both of those areas and arenas.
Yeah, I think definitely, I echo all that. For me, I was a health science major, so there's definitely a lot of public health exposure that I got throughout my 5 years of undergrad. And that kind of led me to apply to the +1 program at Northeastern, so that it definitely made it easier to get my MPH. But through my undergrad experience and then also the MPH experience, I just realized I had like a big passion for public health, especially now, like the whole world is public health. Like our program said that the applications are going up. I expect that's the same for schools around the country. So it's cool right now. I feel like I'm getting a degree in current events, which is great. But yeah, I think also specifically in our program, like we have MD MPHs and people of that caliber. And I think getting your MPH does make you a more competent healthcare provider, and it gives you a different perspective for sure when you're walking in to see a patient.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So we are waiting on some more questions to come in. So I'm going to fill in the space by asking a question for you guys from me. What is your best interview tip for our participants?
I'll go. I would say, especially for the virtual format, I mean, I guess, and in person too. But for virtual, like test your setup with a friend, like before, like go in that spot, like wear the outfit you're gonna wear, ask them if the lighting's okay, things like that. I did that and it was really helpful. And two, like just smile and like be natural, like practice looking at the green dot and not like the person's face. But I think just smiling and like being super personable makes a difference. Like I remember in like one of my interview stations, like the guy was also like super, super friendly, and like we were just like laughing by the end of it, and it felt so like natural. And I think it's just super important to just like be yourself. And obviously you're super nervous like I was, and I thought I was gonna like pass out before, but then once you start you're like fine. And just being yourself I think makes a really huge difference, because I also think that interviewers can kind of tell if you're sitting there and like you rehearsed some sort of response. So just being yourself and you end up having fun with it.
Before we move on to the next individual, Andrea, you said interview station, which to me is a light bulb that it was MMI. Can you explain what MMI is to our participants?
Yes, I can. So MMI is you go through 8 stations, or I think some schools do like 6 to 8, but both the schools I did it at did 8 stations. And they ask you like prompts, and they can be anything from like ethical questions, like what do you do if like someone wants to be taken off life support, to like literally just like personal questions about like your life. And you have like 2 minutes to read the little scenario, and then you enter like the virtual breakout room and you like talk for a few minutes. And I was super, super nervous with this format. I was kind of mad when I had to do it, honestly. But then like, I don't know, I ended up really, really liking it more than a traditional format, just because kind of going back to the internet thing, do not go on Student Doctor Network and like look up what like potential questions are, because they won't be true anyways. And also like my biggest piece of advice is like you kind of talk, get your response, like it does end up being a conversation as well, where you get to like talk about yourself and like bring in personal anecdotes. It's kind of fun, like it goes by really fast, and like you don't have time to think about like being nervous either. So I ended up really liking it. And if you do get an MMI, I would recommend finding like a list on the internet of all these like practice questions and literally doing like an interview like a bunch of times and practicing. And that was super helpful for me.
I can go next. So I think one big difference between MD interviews and MD PhD interviews is sometimes they'll really push you on why you want to do MD PhD. Like I had people ask me like, don't you think you're better suited for just grad school? And then I've also had people ask me, don't you think you're better suited for just med school? Maybe not in that like aggressive of phrasing. So I think that like I've heard the interview advice like know your application. And I always thought that was a little bit silly because you lived your application, you are your application, like you shouldn't have to study it. But I think what is important is understanding like your story and like being able to present it in a way that like resonates with people. So like I did spend some time before my first interview kind of like understanding my own path, like looking introspective a little bit more and being like, well, why am I actually doing this? Which of course I feel like everyone has that question. I mean, for me, it's roughly every 3 months, and then I freak out a little bit and then I calm down again. But kind of having that cohesive narrative, even if at the time it didn't really feel cohesive, you can pick and choose what you want to highlight to make your application like a really compelling story. So I found interviewers really looking for like personal stories rather than like how high your GPA is or any of those other kind of like metrics. Because at the interview, you're kind of past that point.
Yeah, I think it's important to just know why you're there, like specifically at the school you're interviewing at. Obviously, it's important to look up a little bit about the program. I think for dental in particular, definitely the big question you're going to be asked at most interviews is why not medical school? So definitely on the contrary to everyone else on the panel. But yeah, it's definitely just a question that I think I got every interview. And you have to be more, and obviously like you know why, so you're gonna feel silly like answering it, but like they want to make sure that you're there for the right reasons.
I think, oh, one, I echo everything everyone said about like being yourself and knowing your story. One, I guess like thing that someone suggested to me was having like a list of words or like character traits, like five to six, that you would either use to describe yourself or describe like what you want in a like physician, like what you think a physician should have or what a medical school should have, like just like your go-to words in case like you get asked one of those questions of like, okay, well, how would your best friend describe you? Or and you could just use the same words for regardless of which question they ask you. Was a helpful like tidbit for me.
Yeah, just jumping on Layla's idea real quick. In one of my interviews, I got the kind of like, well, how would your best friends describe you? And so then I was like, oh, I've answered this before. So I like gave my 3 words or whatever. And then the interviewer asked, well, then how would your parents describe you? And that was like a fun thing where I was like, oh, like think about like different framings of like how we present ourselves to different people. So yeah, I just want to say, I think that's like a really good tip.
That's fun. That's a question I actually never thought. I might ask that in a mock interview someday. So our next question is kind of taking it back to before the application. How did you identify who would write your letters of recommendation, and what steps did you take to ask that individual? Any advice on that?
I can start. I think like personally, I've always been super, super close with a lot of my professors, especially because even though I just applied to MD programs, I've been doing research since I was a freshman. They always like gave me advice and things like that. So I kind of just like always knew who I wanted to ask. So when it kind of came time, one of them I was taking like a class again with him. So I literally just like went to office hours and I was like, hi, like, will you write me a recommendation letter? And he was like, oh my God, of course. And then like, and I think an email is like, okay, if you're like not gonna see the person, but it's always nice to still like make it personalized, like, and be like, hi, like, I don't know, say something nice about their class and how they've like influenced you, and things like that. Like I know the MD I asked, I couldn't see her for like 2 weeks and she was a neurosurgeon. So like I knew her schedule and how like ridiculously busy she was. So I like purposely sent her an email at like 5 a.m. when I know she checks her email and she's like, oh my God, of course. I think just like still making it personalized if you can't ask in person. And like, it's kind of a nerve-wracking thing to ask, but like they're always like so excited when you ask and they always want to be like updated too. And like at the end, like they're always like, tell me like what happens and things like that. So yeah, that's what I did.
I kind of feel like I'm on the other side of that coin in the sense that for like, you have to have like external letters, but also internal, like Northeastern professor letters. For my external letters, I was like very close with everyone who wrote a letter for me in that scope. So that was really just, honestly, I probably did, like, they already knew that like at some point I would ask them for a recommendation letter. And so in some cases they had like already written one. So those were super straightforward and I wasn't stressed about them at all. With my Northeastern professor recommendation letters, I never like did research with a professor that I took a class with. And I never really formed like a super strong personal bond with any professors. And so I think it was kind of a anxiety to get over that you don't have to be super personally close to someone for them to write you a good letter. So like professors in my classes, they knew I was a good student. I like participated in class and like really when I was in class, I was very present, but we didn't really have any contact like outside of classes. So the way I went about doing that is like I would send the email, but in that I would not only ask if they could write me a recommendation letter, if I asked like, could you write me a very strong recommendation letter? And then alongside that, I would also always offer to meet with them to talk about my goals, to talk about like my research specifically, because that's really important for my application process. And so kind of like offering to have those meetings alleviates the burden a little bit off of them having to like pull a letter out of their hat, whereas you can give them like core qualities that you want emphasized, that they should, and give like concrete examples of like how you exemplify those things like in their class specifically. And so I think offering to have those meetings is a really good opportunity, because if they feel like they need it, they can say yes. And like giving them an opportunity, I guess what I'm trying to say is giving your letter writers the most opportunity to write you the best letter possible is the best way to go about it. So letting them know as much about you as possible is probably the best way to go.
Thank you guys so much. That's really great advice from you both. And I think one thing I'd like to also just add is that most of you folks are going to be applying with a committee letter of recommendation from Northeastern University. And a committee letter is a composite letter, which means that it includes a letter from the pre-health office, but also 3 faculty letters of recommendation, a clinical letter of recommendation, plus 2 additional letters of recommendation, which are optional. Those 6 letters are going to tell a very thorough and comprehensive story of who you are as an applicant. No one letter should or maybe could tell the entire story. And so that's why the committee letter is such a valuable tool, because even if, for example, like Sophia mentioned, your internal evaluator, your professor letter doesn't say all of that extracurricular stuff about you, maybe your external letter does. And together they give a nice overview of who you are as a candidate. So just keep that in mind if you are applying with a committee letter. So I will interject with my own questions again. We do have time for probably 1 or 2 questions in the hour, left in the hour. So my next question is for all of our panelists, and it's about, let me figure out how I want to phrase this. What do you feel was the biggest falsity you knew about the application process before it started? So I don't know if I said that right, but basically, like, what do you think, what was debunked for you in the application process that you thought going in was going to be a big deal, but maybe it wasn't in the end of the day?
I think for me, like, personally, I had a pretty rough start freshman year. And I didn't get like some grades that like I was, too happy with. I thought I was gonna get nailed on them at every single interview. And I wasn't asked once about like maybe a C that I got in one class freshman year. So it was very refreshing that I didn't have to answer that. I prepared for it mentally every single time. I don't know if that's the case, across the board, but for me personally, I didn't have to experience questions, and no one really asked about like, other than like, what are your biggest weaknesses? Nobody asked about like glaring like weaknesses that I had or anything like that.
For me, I think it was the idea that I had to like be this like perfect scientist in a way. I very much am not into like bench research. Like I'm not into, or like I have like all of my extracurriculars, and a lot of my classes in undergrad were in humanities and in the arts, and I thought that I would get grilled on that, and that they would be like, okay, well, why are you even here, like applying to med school? And despite so much of my application being surrounded and like centered around the arts and storytelling, for me, that was like the thing people wanted to talk about in my interviews, like, and not in a grilling way, but like genuine interest, like what was this photography project about? Like I feel like that was something that I sort of needed. And I think I learned that like early on, and learned to just be like, okay, well, this is who I am and I need to be confident in that story. But yeah, that would be my answer. Like follow your passions, I guess, and it'll all work out in that way.
We just received a question in the chat, and I think it's a great question to end on. So the question is, how did you, or do you, respond to the question, why do you want to be a doctor/dentist? So I'll have everybody end on that note and really just share with our panelists why they want to be a physician, a dentist, or a physician scientist. And Layla, since you just ended, how about you start us off?
Sure. So I guess the way I answer the question is I sort of just walk them through all of my indecision about how growing up, like I wanted to be a doctor, but then in undergrad, like I was drawn away from that and tried to like sort of run away from it. And then I talk about like what sort of brought me back, like I alluded to earlier, like wanting to get more of that individual focus. And then I also bring in my background like as a first generation Ethiopian American, like I want to work with immigrant communities, and that comes from my parents. So I tell a story of like how my parents interact with the healthcare system. And for me, like that's what it comes down to, like wanting to bring in that knowledge and like empowerment to marginalized communities, and particularly like immigrant communities, on an individual and system level.
Thank you. Sophia, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I'll give it like an abridged version, because usually I kind of go through the kind of indecision winding that Layla just talked about. But I like to share kind of a moment. So in my clinical position, I work with neurological and neurosurgical patients. And in my research, I researched the sense of touch. How do we feel touch? And so I talk about how, as I was kind of growing in those two realms that were entirely separate, I started to have these kind of like small moments of connection. Like I would see a patient in clinic with a hand tremor, and then I would start to think about like, well, what are the sensory motor circuits that underlie it? Are there environmental factors that can like alleviate it or aggravate it? And those like small moments that were not constant in any sense of the word really inspired me to pursue this extremely long training program so that I can like live in the intersection between my scientific interests and my clinical ones. And so that desire to kind of like embody both roles, each to a high level, I think will like better inform each other and create like an ideal intersection of excuse me, my specific interests of like sensory neuroscience and neurological diseases and disorders.
Thank you, Sophia. And Andrea, why do you want to be a doctor?
Yeah, so I actually never got asked this question in my interviews, but I will say in MMI they can ask this in very like twisted ways where like they won't come right out and say it, but like they're basically asking you this. So I just kind of tell people like I always knew I wanted to like be in medicine. I couldn't articulate why, and I kind of just like told my story of like how I was able to figure that out, like all the research and clinical experiences that I kind of jumped throughout the past 4 years. And also kind of what Layla said, like I come from an immigrant family and that really motivated me towards certain aspects of medicine and certain aspects of medicine that I hope to change and be a part of. So I think like, really backing it up with like what you've done, but also what you hope to do and tying in some sort of personal connection, it makes you stand out to the interviewers as well. And just really what everyone said, just telling your story because it's going to be unique to everyone. And that's really what they want to hear.
And Jared, why don't you bring us home?
Sure. Yeah. So like I said earlier, my aunt was a dentist and she was a dentist in my town. So like I think in preschool, like I said, I wanted to be a dentist. It's like printed in like my first grade yearbook or something. And then I like got, I had some experience like in hospital and I was like, oh, maybe I want to, go into medicine. And then, after doing co-op and stuff like that, I think it was what people wanted for me, not what I wanted for myself, which is, a great pro of co-op. But I think just definitely like speaking to that was huge for me. And then for me, bringing in the public health aspirations that I have, I think the intersection between oral health and public health is really neglected. And I also think, I would love to like bridge the gap kind of between even oral health and medicine. I think they're both pretty siloed as it is. So, kind of just explaining that and how that's what I want to do. And those are my aspirations. I think that really helped me.
Thank you, Jared. And thank you to all of our panelists today for sharing their insights about the application journey with our participants. Super helpful and definitely answered a lot of really tough questions about what to expect through the application cycle. So thank you all again for joining us and sharing your stories, and for our participants for being here and asking such thoughtful questions.